Wow, it feels like it's been feels like it's been forever. Holy crap. Today's story is actually one of my favorites because it not only shows some of the very creative ways Oni could manifest and attack people, but it also shows us how one of the most ubiquitous Japanese words in the world, samurai, for most of its history actually, didn't mean what it means today. Plus, although this is a spooky story, it's actually kind of funny except that, somebody dies. Yokoso owashitare, and welcome back to yet another classical Japanese folktale. And if you like Japanese history, you like Japanese culture, or you just like storytelling in general, please don't forget to like the video, please subscribe to the channel, because again, there are plenty more of these stories where this one comes from. And without any further delay, let's just get into the story. I know it's been a long time, but you know what? I'm glad to be back. So let's get into the story. Once upon a time, ima wa mukashi, there were two young samurai in the service of an unnamed person, who one summer evening were hanging out on the veranda of a hanachi-ide of a certain house. Now first, I should explain what is meant by the word samurai, because it's probably not what most people think. At this time, samurai was basically a jack-of-all-trades servant to the nobility. They were typically tasked with taking care of pretty much anything that their bosses wanted them to do, things like running errands, delivering letters, and sometimes, like in this case, standing guard. But the idea that samurai were exclusively or even primarily warriors would have been absurd to the people in these stories. And in fact, if you had called some of the great warriors of the time, i.e. my boy Tairyu no Masakado, samurai, they likely would have taken that as an insult and had your head removed from the rest of you. Basically, in the eyes of the people in these stories, these two samurai were nothing particularly special, and that is the word that it does use, specifically samurai. They weren't abnormally strong or skilled in violence like actual warriors tended to be, and likely hadn't spent every waking hour of their childhoods devotedly studying the blade, or the arts of war, or anything like that. They were just your average, mid to low-ranking aristocrats just trying to make their way in the world, which is what the term samurai denoted at the time. On this particular night, though, these two samurai had been tasked with guard duty. And so while they were at the house in question, they weren't actually inside of this house. Instead, they were situated just outside of the hanachi-ide, which is an offshoot building that was connected to the main hall of the house, but was still distinct from it. And they were sitting on a veranda, a little ways from the entrance of this offshoot building, this hanachi-ide. Now, it was a very nice night, and the two men were more than happy to be out on the veranda, whiling away the hours chatting to each other, with the summer breeze rustling delightfully through the trees and grasses in the garden, and the night bugs singing their soothing tunes, and they sat there gazing at the bright moon, which gave enough light that they could see fairly well all around them. Now, while these two men weren't warriors per se, they were from a more rural part of the country, and as such happened to be a little more daring and rougher than your average capital samurai. Again, samurai doesn't mean warrior here, it means something more like servant. And as a result, they both had a habit of carrying a sword, a tachi, on them at practically all times, and tonight was no exception. But anyway, these two samurai were happily chatting away with each other about this and that while they were on guard duty, just passing the evening hours with the pleasures of the nighttime scenery, probably cracking jokes, calling each other names, reminiscing on the good old days of their boyhood, and, all of those things that young adult men tend to talk about when they're hanging out with their friends. Technically, though, there was a third samurai, one who was probably at least a member of the 5th rank and a bit higher on the food chain than the other two, because instead of being awake and on duty with these two, he was tucked away in one of the rooms actually inside the house, blithely sleeping away the evening. He also was not from the rural areas, and therefore was not prone to carrying his sword around with him everywhere he went, nor was he possessed of the same kind of brash bravado that the two other samurai were. Swords, bows, weapons, horses, fighting, those were all things that warriors liked. And warriors tended to be uncouth country bumpkins who had no appreciation for the finer things in life like poetry, music, or the current fashion trends. As such, this third samurai, who was also a little older than the first two, couldn't be bothered to bring a sword into his current place of repose. That would be ever so beastly. He was a member of the 5th rank, after all. He had a reputation to uphold as a gentleman. And even if he did stay up and subject himself to these other two's juvenile rustic banter, honestly, his presence really wouldn't change anything. Here were 2 stalwart young lads, perfectly happy to stay up into the wee hours of the night, who would jump at the chance to make a name for themselves through martial prowess if, in the 1 in a million chance, some ruffian did break in and the place needed defending. Better to spare himself their uncouth dronings, let them take care of the defense of the property, which they seemed keen on doing anyway, and make sure he was well rested for what tomorrow would bring. Gotta have your beauty sleep so you can better curry favor with your superiors and distance yourself from anyone lower than you on the totem pole. And while I'm very clearly harping on this 3rd samurai, probably more than he deserves, the 2 younger guys, honestly, they really didn't care. In fact, they may have preferred that the senior samurai was not there, so they could talk about the things that they wanted to talk about, like riding and shooting bows and all of those kinds of things without their senior's eye rolls and scoffs. They also probably appreciated the chance even to crack jokes about him being a frou-frou pansy who wouldn't last a day outside of the city behind his back. He could stay inside and sleep away the beautiful night if he wanted. What difference did it make to them? And so, the 2 juniors continued their chatter while the senior snoozed away inside the actual building, everyone happy to just continue on in this way. The hours passed with the young men thoroughly engrossed in their conversation, and soon the night grew old, with no sign of the junior samurai letting up on shooting the breeze. That is, until sometime around midnight, the enjoyable nighttime peace was shattered, when all of a sudden, there was a loud, sudden, wooden scraping sound from the ridge of the roof on one of the other buildings, and a single wooden plank, seemingly of its own accord, just suddenly jutted out from the rest of the roof and then just kind of sat there. The 2 junior samurai had the thing in full view, and their attention, of course, was immediately pulled towards this plank as soon as it happened. Confused and not sure what to do, they sat there for a few seconds until one of them asked in a hushed voice, What the heck is that?" The other replied equally hushed, I don't know. A board randomly sticking out of the roof like that? That makes 0 sense. Unless there's somebody there." And here, the reality of their guard duty crept to the forefront of their minds, and one of them said, "Do you think it's someone trying to climb onto the roof to find a place to set the house on fire? That doesn't make sense, though. If they were already on the roof, they wouldn't have made a plank stick out like that for no reason, and if they were trying to use the plank to get onto the roof, why would it be on the roof and not closer to the ground? Okay, good point. But then, what is even happening?" Back and forth, their conversation went low and quiet, puzzling over what exactly they were seeing. But after a minute or so of debate about the whole weirdness of this situation, the plank inexplicably burst off of the roof and started flying through the air, spinning end over end, propelled by some sort of unseen force, and even changing direction mid-air, like it could control itself, like it was flying, like actually flying. And it was headed right for them at a dangerous speed. Both of these samurai immediately realized that this was some kind of oni that had transformed into a wooden plank. And almost in unison, each of these men got up on one knee, drew their respective swords, and waited, eyes unwaveringly fixed on this strangest of opponents, ready to cut it to pieces as soon as it flew in reach, and looking like the Joker from The Dark Knight, daring it, wanting it to come close enough to meet their steel. But though it seemingly didn't have any eyes or a brain with which to make decisions, this flying killer plank demon seemed to realize that these two samurai were ready with swords, and attacking them probably wouldn't go well. So, just before it came in reach of the men's blades that gleamed in the icy moonlight, it suddenly veered off and sped toward the entrance of the house leading into the Hanachi-ide and the room that the senior samurai was actually sleeping in. It seamlessly slipped in through the door that had the slightest crack in it and disappeared into the dark. A moment later, the two men heard a loud thunk, followed immediately by the senior samurai wailing in agony. This repeated a few more times with a flurry of banging and crashing noises that sounded like a full-on brawl was going on inside, with the senior samurai screaming from a mixture of surprise, pain, and desperation. Then there was a particularly loud thunk, and the screams of the senior died instantly, followed by a few more smashing noises. The two junior samurai sprang to their feet and sprinted around the house, rousing everyone they could from their sleep, yelling out an explanation of what just happened, and telling the men of the house to grab torches and follow them. In just a minute or two, there was a small crowd of people gathered outside the room the senior samurai was sleeping in, and with some small hand torches, everyone went in. As soon as the light of the torches fell on the senior samurai, it was clear that he was dead. The text specifically says that he was completely flat, like he had been beaten and smashed into a pancake. I don't know if this is technically exaggeration or if he really was totally flat, but either way, it was really, really bad. There was no sign of this plank. The two junior samurai, although they had gone to wake everybody up, had mostly maintained a view of the building and never saw it fly back out. But neither was it anywhere inside the building. It had inexplicably disappeared. But I mean, it was a killer flying plank, so it wasn't hard to believe that it could do other magical things, and Oni were indeed known for being able to just disappear into thin air. But, as it was nowhere to be seen, there was nothing really left to do. I mean, you can't really track down and slay something that isn't there or could just be hiding as a literal plank of wood. So, after making sure it wasn't hiding in some corner waiting to pounce, the people simply gathered up the senior samurai's body and took it away to do whatever it was that they were going to do with it. And while the story itself does end here, there is of course a moral that follows and is a bit longer than usual. The text points out that when this plank demon saw the two junior samurai armed with swords and ready to fight back, it changed its course and instead found somebody who was unarmed and sleeping and decided to claim him as a victim. The writer of the story, whoever wrote this story down, then goes out of his way to say that although he doesn't know if that house had any other demon problems before or after this occurrence, this is an example of why men should be armed at all times. And thus, it is said that the men of that house never cease to keep their swords close to them. Specifically, the phrase that it uses is, Otoko to nari nan mono wa nao tachi katana wa mi ni gusu beki mono nari. Which again basically just means anybody who is considered a man should have at all times on them, well, I guess it doesn't necessarily say at all times, should have on their person swords and katana. At the time, katana was more like a small, like dagger type thing, but some kind of a weapon, is what it's trying to get at. Which again is something that I find a little bit amusing considering what would happen a few centuries later with the end of the Sengoku period and all through the Edo period, where basically nobody except for the samurai was allowed to have weapons, but, I guess the times they do a change. They are a-changing? They do change? They did change? Whatever. Anyway, so that is actually the end of the story, and if you did find that story enjoyable or amusing, please don't forget to like the video and please subscribe to the channel, because again, there are plenty more of these stories where this one came from. And please feel free to share with everybody you know who might be mildly interested in Japanese history, Japanese culture, people, creatives particularly, who maybe are looking for some inspiration. I mean, I'm not a particularly creative person, but somebody who is like writing their own stories might hear some of these and get some really interesting ideas. Again, I'm not a creative, so I'll leave that to you guys. Or you can share it with people who just need something to throw on in the background while they're like stuck in traffic or like doing menial house chores, because that's how I usually consume most of my YouTube. And if you have been watching all the way up to the end here, I do thank you sincerely. Ito ureshiu koso hanberi kere. And hopefully, we will see you next time for another Oni story, where the Oni once more takes on a very unusual appearance. And I can say, it is a very, very unusual appearance, and this story is going to be a little bit shorter than the previous ones, but it's still interesting in showing us what Oni are, what they can do, and why we should be concerned about them. Anyways, with all of that being said, I am going to end it here. Thank you so much, guys. We'll catch you later. Goodbye.